Welcome. Greetings to this edition of The Critical Catholic. I'm Mike Lewis. I'm here with David D.W. Lafferty, and today we're going to talk about a conspiracy theory that's actually over 40 years old. I guess 43 years old now, almost. We've been picking a lot on contemporary Catholic conservative conspiracism and the conspiracy theories that are big today. But today we thought we'd go with one that was actually embraced and promoted by Catholics on the left. So, hi David, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to talk about this stuff because this stuff's fun and it's a little different than, dealing with stuff that's going on right now. That's a little more raw. So we're going back in time.
Well, I guess as fun as deaths and sudden deaths and accusations can be, but yeah. So we're going to talk about the death of Pope John Paul I, who was Pope for 33 days. In the second half of 1978. So he was elected, I think, August 26th, and he passed away. Do you know the exact date? He was basically Pope for the month of September, following Pope Paul VI, now Pope St. Paul VI. And then after he passed away, he was replaced by the conclave came back and elected Pope John Paul II, who was the first non-Italian pope elected in something like 400 years. So, David, why don't you share with us your opening thoughts, and then we can go into the opening prayer and the discussion.
Sure. Opening thoughts. Like you said, we tend to pick a lot on the traditionalists in the church, especially. That tends to be a hotbed of, not all traditionalists, I know, but there tends to be a hotbed of conspiracy theory. In more recent times, there's been a real explosion of conspiracy theory on the right in general within the church, and among the right in our society at large right now. But this hasn't always been the case. I'm old enough to remember when conspiracy theory seemed to be more, as far as I had experienced it, seemed to be more a thing of the left. And it was a very different sort of mentality and a different sort of approach. And it usually involved, critiquing all of the stuff that was going on to keep sort of right-wing forces in power within society, right? And it's some of the same characters, like the Freemasons and stuff, were seen to be behind that. I remember there was all this stuff about, George Bush and his connection to secret societies and all this kind of stuff that was very big on the left for a little while. And I think this sort of fits into that general mentality. And it's very similar in some ways to, what we saw in the 2000s when the Da Vinci Code came out, and the conspiracy theory that was outlined there about Opus Dei in particular being connected to, secret societies that were protecting this idea that, Jesus had been married and stuff like that. It really appealed to a certain part of the population, even though it was, just on the face of it, it was just so ridiculous. But it obviously had huge impact on people. And I remember all the books that came out trying to debunk this stuff, back in the 2000s, all the Da Vinci Code stuff. And it was, some good work was done there. But yeah, this is sort of in that sort of genre. Maybe it was the precursor to some of the Da Vinci Code stuff. But I got to say that this conspiracy theory that we're going to look at is a little more rooted in reality. I'm going to say I don't think that there's anything really to it in terms of the when it comes to the death of John Paul I, but at the same time, it does deal with things that really happened for the most part. There is a lot of sort of insinuation and
there's a degree of maybe
Sorry.
plausibility based on the circumstances. I think that
Yeah.
make some of it believable, at least on the surface, until you dig down.
At least it's a little more like getting like JFK conspiracy stuff where they do tend to remain somewhat rooted in reality and things that are actually documentable, but it's how it's all brought together that's the important thing, and that's where you notice where the flaws of it kind of come in. But it's actually really fascinating stuff. So looking forward to getting into that. But maybe we'll do a quick prayer first.
Yeah.
So in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit,
Amen.
Amen. Heavenly Father, please guide us in our discussion. Help us to dispel confusion, discern fact from fiction, and cleave to the truth. Allow us to contribute to the creation of a healthy Catholic media culture. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
So, David, why don't you bring us back to 1978? Obviously, we had just had the two popes of the Vatican Council. Paul VI was, in some ways, it's interesting because he gets a lot of criticism from both the left because of Humanae Vitae in 1968, and he gets a lot of criticism from the right, from the traditionalists who don't like the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. So, and also, I guess his personality. People compared him to his predecessor, John the 23rd, and he, I guess, had a little bit more of a melancholic personality. John the 23rd was a robust, a little bit chunky in size, a little bit more cherubic. Paul VI was a little bit more serious and dour in his approach. He carried out the mission and the legacy of John the 23rd, and he was very close to John the 23rd. In a lot of ways, he was the heir apparent. But anyway, so these years pass, and Paul VI passes away at an old age, and then the conclave happens in 1978. Why don't you give a little bit of background into John Paul I's election, what the cardinals might have been thinking, what kind of approach they were taking when they elected him?
Sure. Well, like you said, I think that the general impression of Pope Paul VI, it really differs on who you're talking to, and a lot of people, if you're reading people from the secular world or the more like kind of liberal Catholic world, he is seen as something of a conservative, a bit of a hardliner, but also this person who was very, like you said, melancholy, indecisive. It took him a very long time to come to a decision, and it would, he'd anguish over it. He was quite sophisticated. It seemed like a very cultured person. And I think that, Pope John Paul I, or Albino Luciani, was, starkly different from him. And it was a really big surprise to the world when he was elected. I think it was a surprise to him as well. I don't know I did read about the intricacies of the conclave, but it seems that there was a liberal candidate and a more like hardline candidate, right? And then
I know the conservative candidate was for the third time in a row they trotted out Cardinal Siri.
Yes.
And he fits into a bunch of traditionalist conspiracy theories. The most famous of which is, they call it the Siri thesis, or the Pope in Red, where in the 1958 conclave, when John the 23rd was elected, supposedly the smoke was white and everyone was expecting the new Pope to come out, and all of a sudden it turns black, and there was no one elected. And then a little while later they elect John the 23rd, Cardinal Siri. So the story goes that Cardinal Siri had been elected and had taken the name Gregory, I think the 17th, whatever the last Gregory was. But then the KGB, who was obviously, they had operatives in the Vatican,
yes,
or the Freemasons. Well, they're probably Freemasonic KGB agents. threatened to nuke the Vatican if they didn't pick their hand-picked candidate, who was, who wound up being John the 23rd. Anyway, so then
I have heard that. Yes, I have. And now I know that the sort of liberal candidate, I think, was Cardinal, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but Pignedoli.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I know that at the time he was considered the sort of prime candidate. What do they call that? Papabile. Of course, my Italian is just terrible.
Papabile. Yeah.
Papabile. Yes. And so he was the one that I guess the world's attention was on in terms of, being a sort of great liberal hope for the church. And then, as far as I understand, there was a bit of a stalemate. They couldn't, reach any kind of agreement on, and so Luciani emerges as a compromise candidate, someone just kind of out of the blue. I think people recognize that he was a good, decent, honest person. Maybe some felt that he was a little naive. It really surprised a lot of people.
He was the Patriarch of Venice, like John the 23rd had been. That's what they call the Cardinal Archbishop of Venice. And he was he came from humble origins. I think that was one of the things. Like, he was not. I would say that probably the closest equivalent, they talk about Pius X, I think, supposedly was a more simple pastor who was a surprise papal candidate. But obviously it's a funny thing today to have this nickname. But I guess the TV era had really just encompassed. I mean, they had Paul VI he was Pope for 15, 16 years, or 15 years or so. And, that's sort of when television and a lot of footage of the Pope was real. So John Paul I was the smiling Pope.
The smiling
That was
Pope.
what he was known as,
And if you look at pictures of him, he does have this wonderful smile. He just looks like a very friendly, warm.
Oh, I have one.
You have one. Yes, there we go. The smiling Pope. Yeah.
The smiling Pope. There he is. There he is, smiling again. But I mean, I guess that's the funny thing, is they weren't used to that.
Yeah.
And then I know that in some of the
reading,
some of the reading that I did, I just read a review of John Cornwell's book from the 80s. That was sort of the follow-up to the book that we're talking. But he was, I think that he was reserved. He was shy. It was one of those situations where I think he became cardinal and then Pope, but he wasn't ever. He didn't exhibit that that kind of self-confidence or ambition that maybe a lot of other cardinals do. He was seen as very humble in his approach and very pastoral. And I know that he took, he was a bishop during the time of Vatican II, and he very much embraced those reforms. And in some ways, I think people see him as maybe a proto Francis. A couple of, and I don't know, sorry to jump in, but some of the other
things, no, that's great. Yeah.
Some of the other aspects about him, because I've read about him quite a bit. The funny thing is, I think there were three things about him that were set new precedents for the papacy. The first one is he's the first pope ever to pick a double name. And he was actually, so he took the names of his two predecessors, John and Paul. And I believe, and I was not old enough, I was actually not born at the time that he was Pope, but my understanding is, unlike Pope Francis, he actually went by John Paul the First. Like that I was after his name. It wasn't added, maybe someone can correct me in the comments, but my understanding is he added that that I afterwards. But so the double name was unprecedented. The other another thing was Pope Paul VI had refused or had given away and sold the Papal Tiara, the crown, the big jeweled crown. One of them is in the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., and it's on display there. But sold, and the proceeds were given to the poor. And so John Paul I was the very first pope to be installed without a coronation. It was just the installation mass, I guess is the term. He also, I believe, refused the sede gestura, and the chair that was carried by the attendants. Although they may have convinced him to ride in it once or twice, but he really wanted to get rid of it
shortly after.
And John Paul II, totally did away with it, and that's where we got the Pope Mobile. And the other thing is, I believe in his addresses, he was the first pope, rather than to refer to the office as we, he said I. He used the first person singular, which became the norm under John Paul and Benedict and now Francis. Although, if you look up his one or two, Adam Rasmussen is Sedia Gestatoria. That's the fancy chair that the Pope used to get carried around in. Thanks, Adam. And but he used I. But if you look up his speeches on the Vatican website, here's the funny thing: the translators went and changed them, all of his I's to we's.
Yeah, so, there's facing resistance, right, from the Curia and that sort of thing. They were trying to work against him a little bit there, and that's something that comes up a fair bit here.
Yeah. So it was sort of like he had his own ways, which were not the ways of the Vatican. Who knows what would have materialized if he would have been more assertive about it later on. You get the feeling from a lot of these popes, especially as they age, like you heard. Pope Benedict saying he didn't have the strength to do this, or he didn't have the strength to do that. There's the one interview where he said he wanted to be known as Father Benedict instead of Pope Emeritus Benedict, but he didn't have the strength to talk him out of it. I think there's a bit of bullying. That, I don't know if bullying is the right word, but I know that, for example, one of the things is when Pope Benedict came in, the people, his attendants, were a little bit more traditionalist than, John Paul II. He called his own shots in his own way. But one of the things that I'd heard was that with Pope Benedict, like they put him in these hats and in these robes and these jackets and things that were, really old fashioned and traditionalist. And people were, people would talk about Benedict the fashion maven, but really what it was he wore whatever they told him to wear. Pope Francis, I guess, was a little bit more assertive in the other direction. But
it's funny. We imagine the Pope often as being this, supreme ruler who can, anything he wants gets done immediately. Nobody questions him. Nobody, and it's, I think when you look deep into how this actually works, it's not really like that at all. The Pope is always in the midst of this huge machinery that's been, running for, as long as, just for so long. It's unbelievable. There's going to be resistance all over the place. There's going to be at times, like little tricks that are played on the Pope, right? And people will try to influence the Pope, try to intervene in decisions and all sorts of things. So I think that's actually a perfectly normal part of how things work at the Vatican.
Yeah, I think Pope Francis came in with maybe a little bit more self-assurance or a little bit more of a mandate. But you had these stories early on about how, like, he has the Swiss guard standing outside of his room at 2 a.m. and he's like, "Have you eaten anything? Are you hungry? You want me to make you a sandwich?" And Swiss guard's like, I'm not allowed. And he comes out with a folding chair and tells the Swiss guard to sit down. And he's like, I'm supposed to, but there's a lot of, small t tradition that's built in with the papacy and with the Vatican. And I think that in a lot of ways, John Paul I was possibly, I mean, and granted, this is all retrospective and based on other people's analyses, but was maybe overwhelmed by the weight of the office.
Yeah, like they often, he's often described as a bit like Pope Francis later on, just walking around the Vatican and talking to people, just walking up to them saying like, "Hi, how are you doing?" And what are you working on today? And that sort of thing, and it's depending on who's talking about it. It can either be portrayed as he was doing the sort of Pope Francis thing, going out and speaking with people, or it can be portrayed as he was kind of lost, like he was wandering the halls, trying to figure out how things worked and what he should do. And it's probably, the truth is probably somewhere in between. But yeah, maybe he was a little ahead of his time. It took, John Paul II and then, Pope Francis, and to kind of like, create this new understanding of what a Pope can and should be. But I think, even Pope Francis faces resistance sometimes, right? So it's a tricky thing for any Pope, I think. But yeah, I think he captured people's attention and people's hearts, because he had that quality of a normal person, a very humble person. He came from this poor background. He was a pope of the poor. The idea was that he was going to bring the idea of the Catholic Church as the church of the poor, back into reality, because I think a lot of people felt that it had, gotten lost in the world of, power, right? And so, yeah, when he dies, it's a huge shock and a huge disappointment for anyone who had placed any hope in any reforms that he might have initiated or where he was going to take the church. And even at the time, some were suspicious about how how quickly his death was dealt with, how quickly they moved on to the next conclave. So even at the time there were suspicions, but these kind of all gathered together and people started doing investigation. Eventually we get this book coming out in 1984 by David Yallop called In God's Name, Investigation into the Murder of Pope John Paul I. And this is a massive bestseller, 6 million copies worldwide by now. And it really sunk into the popular culture of the 1980s. Many people have pointed out to us, as we mentioned we were going to be talking about this, and everyone brought up Godfather 3. And yes, apparently, now I got to admit, I have not seen Godfather 3.
And I haven't watched the whole thing either. But
I haven't watched the whole thing either. Okay. But yes, from everything I know about it, it does contain a part of the plot involves this murder plot against the Pope, and involves characters that are sort of loosely modeled off of what was presented in this book, in God's Name. I don't know if anyone watching this is a music fan, but back in the 1980s, there was a band called The Fall, and actually their singer just died a few years ago, Mark E. Smith, but they were kind of this legendary post-punk band, and they put out a single called Hey Luciani. I think it was in 1986, and that one became a sort of underground hit. And the lyrics deal with this whole conspiracy theory. I guess the singer Marquis Smith had read David Yallop's book, and he actually created an avant-garde play that I don't know. I think it maybe ran for like one night. It was
Yeah,
called.
there's an interview on YouTube where he's being interviewed about this play, and he's like, "Yeah, I didn't really." They're like, "It's interesting. You don't have any actors in this play," and he's like, "Well, I put my friends in the play,
Yeah.
and some of them are very good performers." So it's like,
Yeah.
and you didn't actually like do any research or follow the facts. And he's like, "No, I didn't really do that." But yeah.
He just thought that
on YouTube.
Thought it sounded cool. Hey, let's make a play out of it.
Exactly.
And it was called, the full title of the play was Hey Luciani, the Life and Codex of John Paul I. So yeah, I've never been able to find any like a video of the play itself, but I know the song Hey Luciani very well, and it's kind of a classic. So check it out on YouTube if you can. The Fall, Hey Luciani. It's
so
interesting.
Just to sort of sum up, in the popular consciousness, the death of John Paul I, which was attributed to natural causes, that some people think it was an embolism, some people think it was a heart attack, but it has, just like, I guess you would say, like the Kennedy assassination, or maybe people would say like the Jeffrey Epstein suicide. This became one of those conspiracy theories in the popular consciousness that people, a lot of people just took for granted, or a lot of people believed that there clearly has to be more to this. He was 65 years old. He had just been elected Pope. But there were certain factors, and maybe you can go into this into a little bit of detail, surrounding the circumstances of the discovery of his body, of the the medical analysis, or whatever. I wouldn't even say there was an investigation, but sort of how that was dealt with, and then going right into the burial. There was no autopsy. He was embalmed within a day, and buried very quickly thereafter.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look into this deeply, there's just so much detail that people go over about the circumstances of his death. But essentially, he died through the night, and he was found. It was, I think, at first it was claimed that he was found by. Now I don't know my notes on this, but I think it was Father Maggie, or McGee, or so. Yeah, McGee. Yeah. Who had been living in a room kind of nearby temporarily. But it was later revealed that it was a nun that had found him. And I believe it was the nun who kind of acted as his sort of, personal assistant and nurse and that sort of thing.
Well, McGee was his secretary, I believe.
Yeah.
And then the sister, he was very regimented. And so he would receive his coffee outside of his room. She'd knock and say, "Holy Father, your coffee is ready," at like 4:45 every morning. This particular morning, she comes by, knocks on the door. 10 minutes later, he hasn't gotten his coffee. And then I believe she opened the door and discovered his body. And this is something that I think we don't have an official story on, do we? I mean, or an official narrative, because so the original story is that Monsignor McGee, or Bishop, he eventually, I think, became an archbishop, but he discovers him sitting upright in bed with a serene look on his face, with the glasses on the end of his nose, reading the lives of the saints.
No, first I thought first it was Imitation of Christ. That's what I.
That's right. It was. Yeah, I was thinking of Butler's. No, it was Imitation of Christ, by Thomas à Kempis. That's right. Yeah. And then the story kind of shifted to where it was it was actually just a book of reflections, or sermons or something like that. Okay, but then then they find out that it was the sister that actually, and so there are different versions of this story that are coming out. Now, the reason why I think they portrayed, I believe, and I don't know if this has been confirmed, but the theory at least is that he was found crumpled on the floor. And that was, not necessarily the most dignified. It's a bit of hagiography. The thing is, it's like, that's not going to fly when somebody dies under circumstances where people want to know information. And they basically give this, this hagiographical, this fictionalized, serene vision of death when in reality it was, it was quick, but he wasn't going to be smiling. And, and he wasn't going to be holding on to whatever book or whatever he had in his hands.
And I think Yallop, based on his research, claims that Pope John Paul I was lying in bed, but he had a sort of contorted grimace on his face, like he had been in serious pain, and then he was clutching this something in his hand, which, as you mentioned, it was first described by the Vatican as a copy of the Imitation of Christ. Then it became like a collection of sermons that he was reviewing. And then Yallop, he claims in his book that it was actually his notes regarding some changes he was going to make regarding people assigned to various posts within the Vatican. And
was it also supposed to be his document overturning Humanae Vitae? Because that was really the crux. Of Yallop's theory.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's another aspect of it. So one part of it was, he was supposed to be holding this this document that would have outlined the changes to or the organization of the Vatican and some of the plans that he had that would have rocked the world, kind of thing. That's the it's just too. While the idea of him dying with a sort of, serene look on his face, with the Imitation of Christ is kind of, it's hagiographical and sort of ridiculous on its face. So is, I think, the idea that he died with clutching this, this bunch of papers that outlined his revolutionary plans for the church. It does seem a bit much, and maybe it is true that it was just some stuff he was looking over for the next day, or for a homily or whatever, that we don't really know. It's what he was holding disappeared. So apparently he had a glass of water beside the bed or something like that, slippers, and those disappeared as well very quickly. The person who Yallop blames for kind of pulling this whole sort of cover up regarding his death is Cardinal Villot, who was the Villot, who was the Vatican Secretary of State at the time, and so he came in very quickly. Apparently, grabbed a bunch.
Well, he also had a meeting the night before, with and was apparently the last person known to see John Paul I alive. And the reports, or certain people claimed that they had a very contentious meeting, or they fought, or something like that. McGee and other people who were there claimed that it wasn't a hostile meeting or anything. Although they I guess the two of them didn't see eye to eye, and I guess people thought that Below maybe was a Freemason, or that. I mean, we can go into that a little bit more.
We'll get into
obviously
that.
The Freemasons are going to show up. It's a Vatican conspiracy theory, so they have to.
Yeah.
But
part of this idea that that Pope John, I'll just call him JP1, that JP1 was holding this plan for new appointments within the Vatican was that he was going to rid the Vatican of people who had been revealed as Freemasons, and we'll get into that a little bit. It's very shaky stuff, but and
just, I guess, one historical footnote, and I remember this distinctly, was in 2005 when John Paul II died, and I mentioned this to you earlier, David. I remember that the official story of his death, and if anyone, I was following it very closely when it happened at the time, but we could see his health was deteriorating. I believe he got a tracheotomy at a certain point. He had been speaking for days, but supposedly right before he died, it's reported that he said, "And now I return to the home of my father," or something like that. And it's like, how in the world did he, but I guess they're always trying to, this is just sort of the way things, it's the nature of hagiography. It's like, let's tell it in a story way when, obviously, with John Paul II, it was clear that he was nearing the end. No one was suspecting foul play. But in the case of John Paul I, when they twist the story, and the thing is, the story with the nun, they didn't want to give the appearance of impropriety that he was found by a woman. Now, apparently she was an elderly nun. He was an elderly man in poor health. Not elderly, he was only 65. But it was ridiculous. But in order to maintain these traditional standards of appearances and to prevent scandal, they create this fiction that makes that then when people are trying to get the facts, make them a lot harder to believe.
Yeah, and this drives me insane because I'm just a big fan of just tell the truth. I want to know what like if you're talking about a saint or if we're talking about a pope, like I want to know what they were really like. Don't give me the sort of idealized version of it, because for one thing, it gives people who are trying to dig into the lives of popes or the lives of saints in order to debunk them and all this, it gives them fuel, right? Because there are some things that are just kind of made up, and and so I think the potential for scandal is actually a lot higher if you try to cover up the truth, or if you try to make things look even look more dignified or more than they really are. And the idea of JP1 being discovered by a female, would that have scandalized anyone really in 1978? I don't
Not
think
unless
so.
they really, really wanted to be scandalized.
Yeah, I can't imagine, but this sort of the closed world of the Vatican, it did feel that way. But it is certainly, I think, something we'll run into, that this tendency to sort of go into protective mode and try to cover up, avoid scandal, put the most sort of pious front on everything, ends up backfiring always. So I think we've touched on the circumstances of his death, and we'll get into that more a little bit later when we look at the actual accusation regarding what might have happened to him. I guess we can just say that Yala in particular makes the case that JP1 was poisoned, that he had specifically a drug called digitalis, which is used as a heart medication, I believe, but it's also it is used sometimes as a poison, because a large dose can stop the heart pretty quickly, or put a person into a crisis. And it's relatively easy to poison someone with. One of the characters that we're going to be looking at when we get into deep into the financial corruption angle of this, actually tried to kill himself in prison using digitalis, the same drug, and then was later actually poisoned with cyanide. So this kind of stuff does go on. It's not like it's I've realized, digging into this, Italy is a place where poisonings, assassinations, blackmail, all sorts of corruption really does happen fairly frequently, or at least it did happen.
I've also noticed, and this is my own personal theory, which I am sharing publicly for the first time ever, when I read an Italian news story, and no offense to those of you who are Italian journalists out there, but I always assume that the boring facts have been padded by 30% minimum. just to make the story a little bit more interesting. I think,
because it's got to be, it's got to be fun. It's got to be like, it's got to be exciting and full of intrigue. And I mean, it's really fascinating. I mean, I don't know Italian culture all that well, but it does seem that some of the stereotypes we think of when we think of, like, the mafia and political corruption and all this kind of stuff, there's some truth there. At least it plays out in this. Absolutely. So we'll get back, though, later on to the actual circumstances of his alleged poisoning. But I think one thing we should look at today is this narrative that Yallop builds, and which other people have built on as well, that JP1 was assassinated because he was planning on either modifying or fairly radically changing church teaching on birth control. Now, this comes, after you already talked about Pope Paul VI, 1968 encyclical, Humanae Vitae, on birth control, and I think it's important to note that within the larger Catholic world, Humanae Vitae 1968 was a real earthquake, like an absolute, sort of earth-shattering event, on par, I think, for many ordinary Catholics with the Second Vatican Council itself, like in terms of its importance. Just to give a little background on Humanae Vitae, for those who don't know it. So, in 1962, a Pontifical Commission was set up on the family to look into the question of the use of birth control, and specifically the use of the pill, and whether or not it is morally licit to do this. So this commission, it eventually comprised 68 people. And Yallop describes these as a collection of theologians, legal experts, historians, sociologists, doctors, obstetricians, and married couples. So a wide variety of people on this commission. After a long deliberation, I think it was 1966, they submitted their report, which did advise for a change in church teaching regarding birth control. The majority, this opinion was upheld by the majority of the people on the commission, so 64 of them, and then there were 4 objecting, and then those 4 were priests. Now, there was also a group of cardinals and bishops that were overseeing this commission. They got the report. 8 of them voted in favor of the report, so in favor of changing the teaching. 6 voted against, and then 6 abstained. And this is all coming from Yallop's book. Now, someone intervened at this point. It's the notoriously reactionary Cardinal Ottaviani, and kind of
famous character from Vatican II, and then he was, he was the name on the famous Ottaviani report that rejected. I think it was drafted by Archbishop Lefebvre, but the Ottaviani intervention before the new mass was implemented at the end of 1968, I think. Basically, this document that said that it essentially said it invalidated the Eucharist, and
yes.
Ottaviani didn't mean for that to be leaked, actually, and he met privately with Paul VI, and he recanted. But that was a big, he was sort of a proto Cardinal Burke, maybe, but with the exception of that getting together with the Pope and retracting the public document that protested the Pope's changes. So,
he had a lot more power than Cardinal Burke has, right? Like he actually.
That's true. He was the head of the Holy Office, which was the precursor to the CDF at one time. So he's this very significant figure. So he intervenes. He contacts
the four people who objected to or voted against the report, the minority group, these four priests, and encourages them to write their own report. Now, their objections, I guess, had been contained in the original report, but he wants them to write their own minority report. They do, and then that minority report is sent along with the original report to Pope Paul VI for him to consider.
Now, this is a curveball I might be throwing at you, but and you might not know the answer to it. But is it true that, I guess, that report was never meant to be released to the public, but the National Catholic Reporter got a hold of it, is my understanding, and released it?
I haven't looked into it, but you know what I've found? I've found online, you can find PDFs of all the old issues of National Catholic Reporter from the 1960s into the 70s. And I have seen the ones around the release of Humanae Vitae, but I should look at the ones, you know, in the years just before that to see about the leaking of this. I don't know anything about it, but it's certainly an area of interesting research. But yeah, I've seen National Catholic Reporter was definitely reporting on all of this stuff back in the time. And I mean, it was actually, the attention of the world was really focused on the Pope around this time. Now, so you have this idea, though, that things are moving towards this change in teaching on birth control. It was actually, like, I guess you could say it was maybe the sort of prevailing theological opinion, and definitely the prevailing opinion, I think, among ordinary Catholics, that this was going to change. It just depended, like, how much would it change, what kind of theological justification would be used. So it came as an absolute, earthquake when Humanae Vitae comes out, and it basically restates existing Catholic teaching on birth control with no changes, and it even uses a sort of semi-scholastic approach in its justification. So it's like the worst nightmare come true for anyone who was, hoping for this change. Now, it is true, as Yallop claimed, or it appears to be true from everything that I can find, that Albino Luciani, when he in the time leading up to Humanae Vitae, he did believe that a change in church teaching regarding birth control was possible, and he thought it could be justified. And he actually wrote a report, or a sort of private communication, that was then adopted or signed by a number of other bishops from his region, and it was sent to Pope Paul VI. I've read about the report, and but then actually there's a La Stampa published, I think it's a couple of years ago, something about how the original text has been discovered. And I think it's going to become part of a new book on Pope John Paul the First. So that's kind of
actually, I can post that link. If
you can post it, it's great. One of the interesting things about it is he makes the case not for just any type of birth control. He's not arguing that church teaching should be changed regarding other types of birth control, but only regarding the pill. He thinks that the progesterone pill, and I haven't looked into the theological justification behind this, but he thinks that it can be theologically justified, I think, because it works with the body's sort of naturally occurring.
I mean,
something like along those lines.
Not that I'm a bioethicist or anything like that, but my understanding is that prior to the contraceptive pill, there were other forms of contraception, like barrier methods, which kind of place, and not to get too icky, but place kind of a blockage on performing the marital embrace, to use a euphemism. There's an obstruction in the way, or other techniques were more abortifacient, like they would prevent implantation, whereas this would prevent ovulation, which, basically you can partake in the marital embrace without obstruction, and you aren't risking an abortion. So they're thinking like maybe this is the middle ground, and that was sort of the theological or the biological, bioethical justification that Luciani and others seemed to favor. And it's actually I think that's the main reason why they even had this commission. It was because the pill was something novel. Even though it worked towards the same goal as prior contraception, this was it was a different process at work. So, and
I believe it was developed by a Catholic scientist originally, and so people thought, well, maybe we can make this the Catholic pill, like the Catholic version of birth control, even though
and I think with Luciani, it wasn't about buying into the sexual revolution or anything like that. It was just, coming from a poor part of Italy and, seeing how a lot of families were struggling with, all these kids. If there was a theologically possible way, he would be welcoming towards it.
Yeah, that's something that comes up when you read about him, is that this was not at all based on anything. It wasn't really anything to do with the sexual revolution. He's looking at people who had, who were desperately poor, had 10 kids, couldn't imagine how they could support more. And then there was also the question of overpopulation, which was a huge concern at the time, because you had, great numbers, huge child mortality, children starving and all this stuff. And people said the world's population is booming. We need to do something to control it, or there's just not going to be enough resources to go around. And Paul VI himself in Popularum Progressio, I think, the encyclical, had actually said that this is a legitimate concern, and that governments can engage in, it can encourage population control as long as the way they do it is morally licit, right? So now that, I think, gave people, a lot of people, the expectation, and maybe even people like Luciani, that the Vatican was concerned about this, and maybe they would consider the pill as one of these licit ways of controlling population. So yeah, it was not about sexual freedom or anything like that. Really, he was really a people of the poor, I think. But all of this. It needs to be, pretty heavily qualified, because when Humanae Vitae came out, apparently JP1, Albino Luciani, sent a note to his diocese saying, it was something along the lines of, I know this is really a difficult thing, and I really wish that a way could have been found to offer people some kind of, hope or some kind of, way to, he doesn't say it outright, but he's saying, I wish that the outcome could have been different here. But this is what the Pope has said. We have to support it. And he did not flag on that. Now, Yallop makes a lot out of some, I think, fairly little things, like apparently when JP1 became Pope, he avoided sort of addressing anything to do with Humanae Vitae. He seemed to be kind of hostile to the mention of it. Of
course, he was only Pope for a month, so
I know that's the thing. Like you can take these little things and kind of blow them up. And apparently he was in October. He was scheduled. He had agreed to meet with a United States Commission on Population Control. We don't know what the meeting was going to be about. It may have just been, they wanted to talk to the Pope about this issue, there's no indication that this was anything where Pope Paul or Pope JP1 would have said, "Hey, we're gonna work with you, and we're gonna change, our church teaching on birth control." But that's the way Yallop presents it.
Well, Yallop thought he was going to make an announcement or something at this meeting, or that it was going to be
yeah. Like he sees this as like huge, and it was like the fact that he accepted this meeting, that it was going to happen, that all of a sudden the Curia launches into, like the alarms start going off, and they think, no, this is a bad sign. It shows he's going to change the teaching. We got to stop this from happening. I just don't buy it. I don't think there's any suggestion that he was taking any steps to go about even looking into the possibility of changing this teaching. I'm not going to say that he couldn't, because I don't. It's not up for me to say what a pope can and can't do. But I think he probably would have wanted to move ahead based and not. It would be difficult to see a pope contradicting another pope on such a fraught issue so soon after, especially so soon after it had become promulgated, right?
Well, and I kind of noticed that with if you read Pope Benedict's work from prior to John Paul II's papacy and prior to him joining the Curia, his views on issues like divorce and remarriage, or communion for the divorced and remarried, were, I would say that, having read his old document from 1972, he was probably more progressive on the issue than like Cardinal Casper even ever was. And then so as prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith under John Paul II, obviously it's his job to carry out the work of the Pope, which included John Paul's very strong positions on that issue, and so in the other direction. And so when Benedict became Pope, he wasn't going to reverse those positions, even if and I think there's also, okay, well, this has been decided by Rome and so forth. And actually when Francis came around, that's, there was this huge backlash, but actually Francis didn't go anywhere near as far as either then Bishop or Father Ratzinger had, or Casper. It was a more nuanced view that was much closer to John Paul II's. Not that his critics would let you believe that.
They would know. But
it's one of those things. I think he had a respect for. He was a man of the church. Yeah. He respected the papacy. He respected Paul VI, and so I don't think that they're necessarily being his immediate successor. I don't think he had those quick those impulses to change the teaching, and as it stands, we'll never know what his papacy might have been like.
I mean, it's interesting that you talk about Ratzinger in relation to this. I can't remember now exactly where I read it, but I think it was on Twitter somewhere. It was his reaction to Humanae Vitae itself, where he was, I think he maybe expected that the teaching would be reaffirmed, but he was a little surprised at how it was theological.
I think you said disappointed or
disappointed, yeah.
Or he was unhappy with it at first or something like that. And then eventually.
Ratzinger's, his thinking was not simplistic. He was among, this group of sort of elite, theologians, right? And they had very sophisticated ideas. It wasn't before Humanae Vitae. It would have not been a very sort of controversial thing in theology, I think, to see that this teaching could change. Now, I think Ratzinger, as he got older, became more firm in basically just more of a conservative, right? And wanted to sort of push back a little or shape some of the legacy of Vatican II. And then you get people like Hans Kung who go the opposite direction, right?
I think with Ratzinger, sorry, I've got a 4-year-old running up and down the hall.
Yeah, no worries.
But with him, I mean, it was his job. He was the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And when you are in that position, you should be doing what the Pope asks of you. I mean, that's part of the reason why Cardinal Mueller didn't last very long under Francis. I mean, he lasted his full term, but it seemed that Francis worked around him. But it's just a funny.
Yeah,
they were like oil and water, and apparently a lot of these documents just went around him, and the CDF didn't put out any documents, and then he had to find someone he could work with better. And when you're doing your job, like Ratzinger did, you do what the Pope asks you to do.
Yeah. Now, in the sort of, I guess, the liberal Catholic world, I mean, I know I'm using these terms liberal and conservative that are,
I've kind of given up on that. Like, everybody knows what you mean when you say left and right. Like, okay, I understand technically, and we're not talking about politics. We're not talking about who you're going to vote for in an election. But I mean, it's just these sensibilities. It's like, more relaxed on sexual issues, more,
I'm not saying either one is like absolutely right or wrong or anything. I'm just, like but in that sort of liberal Catholic world, and this relates back to about, Cardinal Ottaviani's role. The idea was that Humanae Vitae, the tragedy of it for them was that this was a victory of the Curia, because, and Hans Kung is responsible in large part for getting this idea going, because for Hans Kung, he thought anyway that Pope Paul VI wanted to change the teaching. I don't know if there's any evidence for this at all. I haven't looked into it too deeply, but that what held him back was that he didn't want to contradict past papal teaching, right? And it just seemed to be such a clear contradiction. Any change, even the smallest change would contradict. And so that would undermine the idea of papal authority, or this larger idea of infallibility. And that was what the Curia wanted to protect. And so you have this idea that the church was kind of robbed of something by the Curia because they wanted to preserve their authority over and above the sort of ordinary Catholic, right? And so that's why I think this conspiracy theory plays into that larger liberal narrative so well, because here you have the idea that you have a pope who's kind of trying to fix what had happened, that he's trying to fix this sort of takeover by the Curia, and he's going to make the change that the people actually wanted, right? And then he's murdered for it, right? And so it's once again the Vatican kind of eats its own and consolidates its power, right? And it's a very powerful sort of narrative, right? And now in the end, though, this is the least convincing narrative, I think, for some of the reasons that we've discussed. The fact that Albino Luciani, when Humanae Vitae was actually released, he wholeheartedly supported it and did not waver in his support moving forward. I mean, he seemed to be a very merciful guy. He advocated, I think, taking a very merciful approach to couples practicing birth control, and I think or couples struggling with the issue of birth control. But I don't think that there's any sense that it was going that there was this change was coming. To me, it just doesn't seem possible or feasible that anyone in the Vatican, in order to preserve church teaching, would actually kill a pope. I mean, like, that's you're kind of, by like murdering the pope. I mean, that's kind of the almost like the ultimate sin.
Like, take away his ink and quill and turn off his microphone or something like that. Yeah.
I could see all sorts of stuff going on, like shenanigans, like them trying to, convince him to do this or that, or trying to distract him, or trying to, intervene in one way or another, right? Like, that's kind of normal almost, but to actually assassinate the Pope, it's beyond anything that I consider possible. Now, next week we're going to little
over an hour, so we're going to have a part 2 of this.
We're going to have a part 2 of this, and this gets into the much crazier stuff, but it's actually the stuff that I find a little more like, and I don't think Pope JP1 was murdered, but I actually do find this stuff more convincing, even though it's a lot crazier. It's fascinating, it's complex, but we'll get deep into that next time.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us for part 1 of the JP1 mystery. For those of you who enjoy The Critical Catholic or Where Peter Is Live or wherepeteris.com, consider becoming a Patreon sponsor. And for those of you who are Patreon sponsors, this Thursday, we're going to have a little bit of an open house, or a little bit of a, I guess, a group Zoom. I don't know. You're going to be there, right, David? You try to make it.
Yeah,
I'll be there.
sure.
All your favorite contributors, all your favorite Patreon sponsors will stop by at 8:00. So we're taking a break from Where Peter Is Live, but during that time, Patreon sponsors and contributors are going to have sort of an online virtual party. So you're all welcome to join. We'll pull that together. I'll talk to Rachel and we'll get that going. But anyway, until next time, God bless and take care. And where is that closing music? There it is. All right. Goodbye.